welcome back to Education Joining the Dots. We are GL Assessment, or GL Education depending on where you are in the world. We're a Renaissance company committed to delving into the most pressing topics in education and assessment. I'm your host, Berjees Tata, Education Advisor for Multi-Academy Trusts and former lead of Assessment and Quality of Education for a group of schools in the UK. I wanted to start today with something a little personal. My son has just finished his Year 6 SATs. For our global listeners, this is a national curriculum test of English language and maths administered to all 11-year-olds before they move into high school. This week, my son and I also visited his new secondary school, or he prefers the term high school. He's so excited and so full of questions, but he's also a little nervous. And it made me think about all the parents across the world watching their children stand on the edge of a big change. And, like many parents, I find myself wondering, what do his new teachers know about him? Do they know what lights him up in the classroom? Do they know what he's confident with and can do with ease? And do they also know what he may find tricky? For many students, it's their major change in their social circles, in their environment, in their independence. But more importantly, this also marks a significant shift in their academic expectations. It's such a pivotal moment, and it really brings home how important a transition program can be. And that's why I'm so pleased to have with me here today Tallyia Charalambous and Graham Findlay. They're both on their own journeys of developing a wonderful transition program across their group of schools. Their transition model puts assessment and literacy at the heart of the process, empowering every school and every teacher to prepare not just for a whole new cohort that's coming in, but also to prepare for every child's needs. So, let's dive in. So, hello, Tallyia. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. I'm Tallyia. I'm currently Director of English within the School Improvement Team at Laidlaw Schools Trust. A little bit about me. I relocated to the North East last April after training and teaching English and media in richly diverse secondary school in London. I'd say that experience really shaped my belief in the power of language, especially for students who are still finding their voice in English. A little bit about me personally, I come from a bilingual household myself, and that experience alongside teaching English in India when I was 17, I would say sparked my lifelong commitment to equity in education, particularly through literacy, as you said before. So, Laidlaw Schools Trust is a family of 11 schools, primary, secondary, and alternative provision, serving some of the most dynamic and complex communities across the Northeast. In areas like the West End of Newcastle, one of our schools has over 60 languages that are spoken. We work in contexts of high mobility, economic disadvantage, and, of course, ever changing pupil populations. So, my role as Director of English supports curriculum development, literacy improvement across these schools with a firm focus on ensuring no child is left behind. And of course, within literacy, you've got that strand of reading, which we're going to be talking more about today.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Tallyia. And Graham, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and where you come from?
Yes, of course. So I'm Graham Findlay. I work for the Bishop Wilkinson Catholic Education Trust. We are a trust of 47 schools across all phases, primary and secondary, including nurseries and sixth form. We're based in the Northeast. We cover 4 local authorities up here and cater for around 12,000 children.
Wow, that's great. Well, thank you, Graham and Tallyia, for being here today. I'm so excited to hear and to learn from you both today. So we're talking about transition, and Graham, you and I have been on this journey for about a year and a half now. We've worked through last year's transition program, and Tallyia, you happen to be traveling on the same journey down the same path that Graham's just been on. Let's start with you, Tallyia. Could you tell us a bit about your transition program and your plans for the future?
Of course. So, transition is something that's really important, especially as you shared the story about your son at the beginning of the podcast in terms of the event coming up in July. And I've been working with the Central School Improvement Team and all of our schools, some both primary, so Year 6 and secondary, of how we actually look at transition and how we make sure that we're giving the chance for new students to not only engage with the schools, but also what are we gaining from transition that can help us support students on their journey into secondary, because I think it's really important. We are on the start of our journey, but it is a journey. But one of the big things that we're looking at including and have been including in transition before is the NGRT assessment. So within transition and the year 6 to 7 program, this includes early diagnostics like NGRT into their program. We've used the NGRT reading support pathway profiles in all of our schools to help us uncover hidden reading gaps early. So this allows us to place student on the right pathways from the start, often before those gaps become visible in the classroom.
Thank you, Tallyia. That's really useful for us to understand. So, in terms of your journey so far, what have you found challenging and what made you put literacy at the center of this?
I think as our pupils come with such a varied experience, or experiences, I should say, whether it's linguistic, emotional, or educational, we need an approach that we can also use ourselves to our advantage to ensure that no child's left behind. And I think, of course, we can talk about the COVID gap that we've all faced, which really impacted literacy, which is high on everyone's agenda. We also need to make sure that we're focusing on inclusion of all and giving everyone the life chances they deserve. And as educators, we've all come into the industry because we want to support our children on that journey. So I think a challenge is not just the logistical challenge of, and I'm sure Graham will talk a bit more about that as well, in terms of how we ensure we test all and gather that data, but then what we're actually using the data for and how we are supporting schools, senior leaders, middle leaders to use that in order to make sure all students are on the correct pathway for success. Because I would say reading is the biggest and most important in terms of the biggest barrier to academic success and actually the biggest barrier to all success. So if we get on top of this early, which we're trying to do during transition, it then contributes to our trust-wide vision of transforming life chances for these children.
That's really exciting, Tallyia, to hear. That resonates with my past experience as well. Having taken in children from all over the city into my secondary schools in my previous role, we always wondered, what do they know and what can they access? Everyone's at different starting points. So yeah, having such data is really key to unlocking the next steps of future academic success and success in life, really.
And I think actually that doesn't happen unless we intervene early, personalised support, and then make literacy everyone's responsibility. And I think by doing that on transition, we're highlighting the need for that. And we need to get all stakeholders to buy into that as well.
Wow, yes, you've touched on a really important topic there, Tallyia, about stakeholder management, especially in terms of transition, and also literacy being everyone's responsibility. I'd love to talk more about that in a minute. First, let's find out from Graham. So, Graham, hello. Could you give us a bit of an overview of your transition program?
Yes, of course, Burge. So I was taken back, Burge, when you were talking about your own personal experience you're seeing with your son, and that transition is really important. And actually, it's an ongoing process that children will go through throughout their school lives, from one year to the next, as they progress from primary school through to secondary. We're very fortunate in that we educate children from the age of 3 all the way up to the age of 18 at sixth form. And in our secondary schools, around 70% of pupils come from our primary schools. So we have a really unique opportunity to form the education of children right through their entire schooling. And that gives us lots of positives and lots of opportunity. In terms of our transition process, we begin that at the end of year 5 with a big event that we hold at Gateshead Stadium called the Bishop Wilkinson Celebration of Sport. That brings all of the children in year 5 together from all 42 of our primary schools to compete and enjoy sport together, led by our secondary school sports leaders. So they get that sense of being a big part of a trust, the fact that they're going to progress to work with older children, and that those children aren't as scary as some children might feel. So we begin that process then. And then throughout year 6, we have a range of points where we share data from primaries to secondaries, and that's contextual information about attendance, special needs, any other really critical pieces of data that we would want to share. And reading is a big part of that. And the SATs results give us some information. They give us an indication of how well children have done in their May SATs, as you said in your intro. But we wanted to strengthen that information by getting something more granular with reading. A number of our secondary schools already worked with GL assessment on the new group reading test, and they were doing that test in September. And the challenge with doing that was then it would take a little while to do that test. It would then take a while to interpret the results. So there might be a lag between us identifying children who needed further diagnostics and then getting that support in place. And we felt that we have a really good opportunity in our trust to move that testing forward. So in May and June, our year 6 children, after their SATs finish, over a 3-week window, will sit the new group reading test in their primary school. And so by the middle of June, we've got all of the information that we need diagnostically, in terms of an initial diagnostic, to identify children where we might want to give a little bit more support over the summer to help them with that transition. And also for reading leaders in the secondary to be able to plan what provision they're going to need to put in place for those children. So it means that when children start in September, the vast majority of pupils have been assessed, those that need a little bit of support identified, and then later in year 7, we do a second assessment with them. And that helps us to see who's transitioning well so that we can then revisit that and put further support in place if needed, as well as evaluate how well the success that we're putting in place is working.
That's amazing, Graham. And for the listeners, you probably can't see I am smiling from ear to ear listening to this, because it really does warm my heart to hear how well thought out your plan is. And given the fact that you're testing them beforehand and you have all this information beforehand, you hit the ground running right from day one in year 7 in big boy or big girl school.
And I think that's really key, Berge, because, you know, it is a big step. And what we wanted to do was make sure that if a child needed support to tackle Key Stage 3, which is a step up from Key Stage 2, that we knew who those children were. And also because we had intervention in place from day one, the first week of secondary school, it meant that children got used to it straight away. That it wasn't something that came in late and children thought, oh, well, I must be really struggling because I'm 6 weeks in and now I'm being put on this intervention. So it got away from that stigma that might be created by then putting something in place towards the half term, which tangibly could show a child, actually, this isn't working well for me. The next step of our journey will be to look at how we can support children who are coming from outside of our trust. And we're working very closely with our data protection officer to see how we can overcome those hurdles so that we can reach the sweet spot where by the summer, we know the SATs results, we know an independent reading assessment that's identifying who we need to do further work with, and then we can really identify who might benefit from additional transition in the summer so that they're really prepared to start in September and hit the ground running.
That's amazing, Graham. Thank you. And I could see Tallyia there. There were some clear nods as Graham was talking. What resonated with you there?
So I really believe in a lot Graham's saying in terms of where getting this information early and putting them straight on intervention, and we're using transition in a very similar way, although on a kind of different stage of the journey that Graham's on. We're using this to make sure we're informing our reading interventions, but also our main reading intervention, so our offering for all, which everyone is actually getting access to reading, regardless of what the NGRT gives us. And I think that's really important as well. But in addition to that, those that do need extra support, so those perhaps under chronological reading age or those under functional reading age, will be on intervention. There'll be no child left behind. Every single student that is below functional reading age currently in all of our secondary schools is on an intervention programme, and that would be bespoke to the secondary, depending on the cohort, depending on the staffing, depending on our access to various resources, but they will all be getting support. And I think something quite important that I know we've spoken about before is often the concern around this so-called 6-week dip, the period where students return after the summer and readjust to school routines. And I think we definitely at LST want to be brave. And I think we've had to be brave, especially with all the barriers we've all discussed and what we face. I think we need to be brave, and testing the students on NGRT before the summer shows that we've taken the view that we can't afford to wait. If we don't act quickly, those students could lose access to the rest of the curriculum. And I mentioned earlier that I come from a bilingual household, and I absolutely understand that this differs cohort to cohort. But I think especially for our bilingual pupils and our EAL learners, they may go the whole summer not necessarily communicating in English with another adult. Of course, we have to appreciate there'll be English on TV, English radios, and various other circumstances where they have an experience of English. However, we need to appreciate that they might not have that for 6 weeks, but we need to be brave and we need to make sure we're front loading that support in September. So when Graham said he ensures they will have support from the first day of secondary, I think that's really important, and that totally resonates with us at LST, and we need to hold our expectations high. So if they have been assessed on NGRT before the summer and we think they've come in and they might be a bit lower than where they were, actually we need to challenge ourselves to get them back to where they were before the summer. So I think we need to make sure we don't see the dip as something to avoid.
That's amazing, Tallyia. Thank you. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. You've touched on some really important points there. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Tallyia, for sharing all your thoughts so far. We've addressed some really big issues here, and I'm sure we have a positive way forward for this. So speaking of positive way forward, for our listeners around the world, what advice would you give to other educators who are looking to develop their own plan? And what did you trip over that you hope you can share with someone else that they won't trip over?
I think the key reason that we avoided any real slip-ups when we first did this last year was the careful liaison that we had with GL assessment during this process. So, Berge, you'll know that we worked carefully on this for a period of months to design something that was around reading across our schools before we then thought about what would fill the gap. And through that strategy, we identified that the NGRT would be the best tool to give us our initial diagnostics. And what was really important to us was being able to be supported to understand what those results meant, and the support that we got from GL to interpret our data and understand which children we needed to ask more questions about really helped us to maximize the efficiency of our transition so that we could target the right questions to the right people at the right time.
Thank you so much, Graham. And Tallyia, any final thoughts from you?
I would say my advice to other educators building similar programs is don't wait until a child is failing to act. You need to diagnose on entry, involve staff from the start. And if you're fortunate enough to have digital tools that you can access, align that to your transition work because it can be transformational. And above all, don't put a ceiling on your pupils. Literacy is a human right. So I think if transition is done well, it's how we can protect it and protect our children.
Thank you so much, Tallyia and Graham, for your thoughts, for your knowledge, and sharing your candid experiences and journeys. I'm sure our listeners around the world will really appreciate that. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Berge.
Thank you so much, Berge, for letting me be involved. It's been great.
Literacy isn't the only ability that determines a child's chances of future success. There may be hidden strengths or challenges in other cognitive abilities. Let's move on to our Data Spotlight Explainer, which is designed to demystify data and assessment terminologies. I'll now hand over to Georgina and Emma to explain how NGRT can be used alongside CAT4 to aid transition.
Hi, I'm Georgina Cook, and before joining GL, I was an English lead in a multi-academy trust or a school group in the UK, and I led on literacy and English in one of our secondary academies. Supporting our students at transition was a really important time. As a full-time English teacher, I could teach over 100 students, so you can imagine how long it took for me to learn their names, never mind their needs. When I used the Cognitive Ability Test, better known as CAT4, and the new group reading test or NGRT, their insights were absolutely integral to getting to know our students well as soon as they joined us. Emma, how did you use CAT4 and NGRT?
Thanks, Georgina. I'm Emma Dibden, and I was previously an inclusion lead across 2 international schools. And as the Senko within the primary school, I would often wait with eager anticipation at the notion of the availability of our Year 3 CAT4 data, because that was the first opportunity we really had to truly appreciate a learner's profile. The chance, I guess, to shatter preconceptions, those glass ceilings that we create, and to understand a broader balance of strengths and challenges. So considering CAT4 and NGRT together helped us to really understand where reading attainment was broadly in line with ability and where learners might be attaining at a level that was either higher than their potential or those who were underachieving, which are obviously those that were largely my focus. And so from an identification perspective, triangulation of the universal screener data from something like CAT4 or NGRT really helped us to begin to build our hypothesis of need and to design provision and intervention to meet those learners' needs. Georgina, can you tell us what teachers and leaders could do with a combination report for CAT4 and NGRT?
Yes, of course. It's so important, isn't it, to look across the various pieces of information that we have as leaders and teachers when we're trying to understand the whole child. And they might be numerical pieces of data from a test like CAT4 and NGRT. They might be pieces of information from those points of transition with meeting with primary teachers. But in my experience, by looking at how students do with their CAT4 test, in my case, I was looking at the reading and wider literacy skills. So that would be their verbal reasoning score from CAT4 that I'd be focusing on. And I'd compare it with their results in the NGRT so that I could get a good sense of whether a student's performance matched their potential. And that's really important, isn't it? Because if those scores don't line up from CAT4 and from NGRT, it might be a sign that there needs to be something closer that I need to look at or to dig deeper into. And in terms of scores, Emma, just as a reminder to all our listeners out there, it's the standard age score that gives you a chance to see how students are doing compared to the national average. The SAS, or the standard age score, that's the fairest score to use when making comparisons across any kind of norm reference test. So talking about that combining data then, it might be a good opportunity, I think, Emma, to explain to listeners how the two tests are compared statistically to generate that discrepancy category. Emma, can you explain that in a bit more detail?
Of course, no problem. So on average, you would expect scores from tests with similar or linked constructs to be aligned. So for example, we know that the CAT4 verbal and the PTE, or the progress test in English scores, are highly correlated based on the large data sets of students that have taken both tests. However, we can naturally expect there to be a variation between those two scores, which allows us to generate a discrepancy category. That's an explanation of how common the difference between the two test results is. These categories are based on the distributions of changes that we see in these larger data sets. That's what our statisticians work with as they set the boundaries to say how expected the difference we see between those two scores and those two tests would be. So we define the expected difference to be between the middle 50% of score differences, and then outside of that range, the next 15% of score differences would be deemed as higher or lower than expected. And then the top or bottom 10%, which are much rarer within a normal population, would be deemed to be much higher or much lower than expected. So hopefully that gives some clarification as to how those discrepancy categories are generated. So I know I've already said about the value that I found in terms of looking at CAT4 and NGRT combination reports as a SENCO, but how did they help you as a multi-academy trust English lead, Georgina?
Yeah, sure. So for me, SAT, which are the exams that a child takes at about 11 as they leave primary school and they transition into secondary in the UK. And they're an external reference test that we would get that data as children moved up to us. And they were a good starting point for English. So as an English lead, I would obviously look at the reading and writing data that came up from primary colleagues. But they certainly didn't tell the whole story because ultimately they're an exam and children sit at an exam and they don't always show all of those skills in that examination. So for us, NGRT data was a real game changer across not just the English department, but actually across the whole school. Because if a student struggles with reading, they'll struggle to access the curriculum full stop. So we use that data right from the start of year 7 to identify the support needs of that particular cohort. And when we combined NGRT with CAT4, that's when things really clicked. We had a much better picture of need at that point with the transition data and the external examination data, and then those two key pieces of information that we got about reading and then about verbal ability from NGRT and CAT4. And that's when I would sit with my SENCO and we'd have a really good way over time. I think we developed a very strong, close relationship looking at those needs because we knew we needed to understand those children as quickly as possible so that we could support them right from word go. So we'd sit together and we'd dig deeper into that data. We'd spot gaps between ability and attainment, as I mentioned previously. We made sure that every teacher had access to NGRT data. And then those reader profiles, and the NGRT test has got new individual reports, they help turn those numbers into something much more practical for everyday teaching. And teachers really appreciated those different points of information. Using NGRT alongside CAT4 with those discrepancy categories that you just explained, Emma, that helped us to understand not just where students were, but where they could be. And we would ask questions like, How do this student compare to the national picture? Or are there any barriers in their word reading compared to their comprehension? Or can we see that there might be a language barrier that's going on for this particular student? More importantly, with all of those questions and all of those pieces of information, we were able to focus our support, and we were able to put that support in place in a really timely way so that students could have a good, positive experience when they started with us in year 7. And we could do the same as that at any point of transition, not just in year 7. But without triangulating that data, I would be working in complete silo. And that's not sustainable, especially in a busy inner city secondary school where transition is such a crucial time.
And that's it for this episode. A huge thank you to Tallyia and Graham for sharing their journeys with us. As a parent, it's really reassuring to know that there are leaders out there, like many of you listening, who are thinking so deeply about how to support children through this big change. If you're currently thinking about transition in your setting, I hope our guests have sparked some ideas. From building bridges between primary and secondary teams to using assessments to really understand each child's needs, it's clear that with a bit of thoughtful planning, we can accelerate learning for all children. And if you'd like to learn more about the tools and approaches we've talked about today, you can head to our website, support.gl-assessment.co.uk, or, depending on where you are in the world, support.gl-education.com. If you enjoyed today's discussion, feel free to share more about it by tweeting us using the handle @GL_assessment or @GL_education. If you have any feedback, a comment, an anecdote, feel free to email us at podcast@gl-assessment.co.uk or send us a voice note through WhatsApp on 07917 516 515. We'll be back again in July as we continue to join the education dots. But in the meantime, look out for a new episode of the Renaissance Space podcast. Thanks for listening.
Hello, it's GL here. We would love to hear your views on the Education Joining the Dots podcast, and we'd be very grateful if you could take a few minutes of your time to give us your feedback by following the link to our survey. You'll find this in the episode description on your device, and all feedback is welcome as it will help us to ensure that this podcast meets your needs.